Hello and welcome back, everybody. We're going to be starting our next few talks in this afternoon of the Cambridge Festival. So our next talk will be by Dr. Susanna Mierau. And I would like to remind everybody again that if you do have questions, please include them in the chat. I'll be reading it and can ask your questions at the end of the talk. And then, so without further ado, I'll pass it on to Susanna.
My talk is titled How Babies Learn to See, and there may be slight lag between some of the videos and when they're played because it's going over the internet. So I'll try to take a pause there. Also, some of the videos are a little bit small, so if you have the option to make your screen, the video full screen, you'll be able to see better. This lecture will cover how vision develops over the first year. Here we have one of the remarkable things. Here's our son when he was just a few days old, and our daughter is day 2. So you see that it's not just vision, but the actual size of the brain is increasing quite dramatically over this period. And we'll especially focus on the areas of the brain that process information that comes from the eyes. So many people may be aware that we are born basically what we would call legally blind. This means our visual acuity, or how far we can see away things in focus, is about 3 over 60, which would be 3 meters, seen at 3 meters, what others could see at 60, or in the United States, seen at 20 feet, what others could see at 200. But and this is about the distance from the breast to the mother's face. So the baby can see the mommy's face in clear, but not across the room. And this improves over the first few months of life, until we achieve the adult level of acuity. One of the other features about learning to see in early life that's really critical to the later stages is the ability to move the two eyes together. So here we have our daughter at 1 week old. And if you look closely, her right eye here, you can see the pupil is looking straight ahead, where the left eye is looking over to the right. But you can see that, and if you've ever watched a baby in the first few weeks, you'll see sometimes their eyes move together and sometimes their eyes move independently, and they move more and more together over the course of the neonatal period. And here you can already see at 2 weeks, here's an example of our daughter looking the same direction with both eyes. And this is really being able to coordinate the eye movement is really critical for developing a visual skill, which we call depth perception. Now, some of these old time 3D pictures are those of who were, children in the 70s and 80s may recognize this Viewmaster, but the idea is because each of our eyes, if you open and close one eye, sees a slightly different view, the brain learns to fuse these images over time. And so that's why by separating the two and showing these pictures, you get that 3D perception. Now, scientists have studied the development of this depth perception in babies, and one of the most famous experiments was the visual cliff, here shown from the 1960s. And here the experimental apparatus is there's basically a platform with the strong check pattern, and then it actually extends as clear plexiglass. But the baby can't see the plexiglass, so then the mother stands on the other end and calls to the baby. And if the baby doesn't perceive a big drop, the baby will happily crawl across to the mother. But if it perceives a big drop, it may be hesitant to do so. So just a little warning here, do not try this at home. However, there are ways that you can look at the depth perception developing in a young infant of your acquaintance. So here you can see our son at 6 months. You can see he's already looking, kind of reaching out and trying to calibrate this depth perception. Here he wants to get a little spot of tea. And here I have a little video. So what I want you to see here is the sensory system develops first, and then the motor kind of relies on that sensory. So you can see, even though he's not the fastest at grabbing the food, he did grab towards the back of the tray versus the front of the tray, showing that he has developed some of that depth perception. Here you can see another one. Here I have the, little puffin, you can see him reach several times, and it's not perfect yet, right? He's still developing this integration of his visual information from his eyes and the movement of his arms, but he is able to estimate that depth fairly well. As children get older, they learn to judge even larger distances. And this leads in part to this famous separation anxiety, where the baby starts to realize that mom can get away or dad can get away, and starts to be quite upset when the parent's away. But it also leads to exciting things like cruising. So here, our son, he's not able to walk on his own yet here, but by trying to judge that distance between the coffee table and the sofa, he's starting to be able to use that depth perception to aid in another motor skill, which is walking. So it turns out the early child period is a critical period for learning this depth perception. If one eye is able to move, for example, a problem with the muscle, or one eye doesn't see as well, for example, if they're a cataract or some other problem with visual acuity, then the brain cannot learn to fuse these images together. Fortunately, in the early child period, if this is recognized early on, you can actually patch one eye. In fact, you patch the good eye, which forces the brain to focus more on the weaker eye. And this allows children to, obviously we can take the patch off, to start using both images from both eyes to develop this depth perception. So how does what the eye sees reach the brain? So if you had seen me give the public lectures for the talks in the year before, this is the picture of the PDN lecture theater. There I am down at the bottom. And if you were looking at me right now, or if you're looking at me on the video, the information is coming into the eye, and the part that really helps us know what we're seeing is located, ironically, in the back of the brain. So here's the eyeball in the front. So this is like the forehead, and this is the back of your head. And actually what happens is, if you look here, when we're looking at a visual scene, the information that comes from the right part of our world, we call that right visual field, which here is depicted in green, hits the nose side of the inside of our eyeball on the right side of our head, and the outside on the left. And that information is carried to the left side. So the left side of the brain pays attention to the right side of the world and processes information, and the information from the left side of the world is processed on the right side of the brain. And so we're going to really focus on, so when this information comes from the eyes to the back of the brain, what is it doing? And unfortunately, we know a lot about this location because of injuries. In World War II, the British helmet design did a good job of protecting the top of the head, but unfortunately left this part of the brain in danger of trauma. And so here you can see in 1918, this report where they documented which parts of this area of the brain were damaged and which parts of the visual world could no longer be seen. So one of the biggest advances in really understanding how the brain processes information from the eyes came from two scientists, Hubel and Wiesel, who really discovered that the brain it reconstructs the visual world. And what we're saying is, we have this perception that, it's kind of like a movie projector coming back, that what we see when we look out in our eyes is an exact reflection of the world around us. But it turns out that this is not true. What we see is what our brain has reconstructed from the information in the outside world. And in their experiments that they started in the late 50s through the early 1970s, for which they received the Nobel Prize in 1981, they determined that when they were recording from brain cells in this back area of the brain and showing the cat different pictures, the brain cells responded not to the different shapes or things they tried, but actually when they were pulling the slides out, the orientation of the line. So some cells might prefer a straight edge versus, this many degrees to the right or the left. And what they learned, and what's very exciting, is that the brain starts to learn by detecting edges. And so when the information comes from the eye to the back of the brain, you're basically getting very basic features, breaking down to the world into its most basic components, such as edges, orientation, contrast, color. And so what the baby's actually seeing in the first few weeks if you see the little mobile we got, it's probably something more like that. It's still interesting. There's edges and contrast and color and all these, but the baby hasn't really started to put it together into what you and I see. One of the lessons I learned from our child is that we got this cute little baby lounger to put in the living room. And initially we oriented it like the chairs and sofas so it faced the middle of the room, but our daughter had very little interest in the first few weeks in sitting in it. But we noticed when we turned it around so that she faced the curtains, she was very happy and she'd sit there for ages. And of course, the curtains that happened to be in the flat we lived in at that time in Cambridge had this very striking high contrast pattern. And once we realized this, that I applied the visual neuroscience I knew, it was very clear why this was interesting to her. The brain also learns to then take these edges and basic components and then see motion. And it's that motion that helps us determine what belongs to what that allows us to see form. And so here, these edges and contrasts lead us to form corners and shapes. And this, we also had the funny thing in the first few weeks where we also had this little swing. And we had this fantastic little toy here to attract the baby's attention, but we found that she was often looking off to the side. And then we realized that she was looking at the arms here because when the swing swung back and forth, that stayed steady, but the other stayed the same. And so that motion was really attractive to her in the first few weeks. And either that or she had an early interest in mechanical engineering. So once the babies can perceive form, then objects can catch the baby's interest. So here you see at 2.5 months, she's discovered she had an arm. And if you watch babies in those first few months when they discover their arms and legs, it can entertain them for hours. The arm is a toy that will hopefully not fall off. Here at 3 months, you can see she's finally noticed all these toys that are there, and she's able to distinguish that there's something interesting there. She's maybe a little bit confused why the elephant is turquoise. No, just kidding. And by 3.5 months, she can perceive other shapes, such as reading a book. Okay, that's a joke. Okay, the brain attaches meaning then to objects. So it's not necessarily by 19 weeks, but just to give you an idea that as the child is progressing into months, they start to be able to identify different objects, especially objects that are really important to them, like their parents, favorite items, things like that. And so here, as the areas of the brain that surround so if the basic information is processed here, it's the areas that surround these associated areas which start to put these together so that we get corners and shapes, and then these can eventually be combined to have meaning. Now I've put the words here for us, but obviously it's even later that you get language being incorporated in with the visual. So here's something you can try at home. For recognizing objects. So here is our son sitting at the table, and I put these little food items, which are freeze-dried little vegetable things, and you can see he goes right away, even though there's the tray is there, he recognizes right away that there's something different than just the tray. And even though his motor skills are not up to being able to necessarily grab them very easily, he's able to see that there's something different there. So he recognizes that there's an object. So one of the things you can do to look at this is can you alter the contrast? So here there's a good contrast between the food and the tray, but now let's try the next part. So here in the top left, we have a low contrast, right? Where you can see that there is a little piece of food there. And when I play it, he's looking around, but he doesn't see anything interesting, and then he gets distracted. And so you can see. Now, you can see, if you look before, now if you increase the contrast, so now it's on the purple tray and here, then you see he grabs it right away. So he obviously sees that there's an object there. And even though he's not that interested in it, he still he still grabs it right away because he can recognize that there's something there. On the other hand, you can also try difference between preferred and clearly non-preferred objects. So here he's looking bored. This is not his preferred object, but look what happens when a piece of croissant from Maison Clément gets in there. This is a high preferred object for other people in our family as well. And you can see he immediately recognizes the difference between these two objects, right? They're both something different than the table, but this is very exciting. And then you can see another example here where he immediately identifies not just that there's an object, but something that he's interested in. So clearly he's already attached some type of meaning and recognition of these objects. You can also try this at home by looking at the favorite books at different ages. So here's our daughter at 7 months, and here the books that were most attractive to her had a simple white background and a single object with high contrast. And especially for her, up until this time, those books were the most interesting to her. And as she was able to understand more about the meaning behind the different objects and to understand contrast, we have books with more simple, they're still fairly simple, but now they have little situations, and you can see she finds this highly interesting. And then a book that she had very little interest in at these younger ages, as she became older, it has a more stylized picture here, and she became more and more interested in it as her knowledge of the kind of complex visual social world came into place. And then one thing that was super interesting to me was I had got this book about animals in the prairie, and it's very artistic. One of these where all the pictures are put together with little pieces of paper. And she showed no interest in it prior to a trip when she was about 1.5 years old that we took to Yellowstone National Park in the American West. And then when we came back, she just picked up this book and would look at it all the time and identify with, the bison and other animals that we had seen on the trip. So that was very remarkable to me because it was clear that she had learned things on the trip that were now influencing her interest and recognition. But it's not simple enough for the brain to just see and attach meaning, but we actually have to know where to look. Some of you may recognize these kind of busy scenes where then you're tasked with finding something in there. If I asked you to find a sailboat, you probably almost within seconds immediately be able to identify where the boats are, because without either consciously or more likely unconsciously, you already have perhaps interpreted this as a beach scene, equating the yellow with the beach, the blue as the water, and the lighter blue and white as the sky. And so if I say boat, you immediately look for the boat in the water. And if I say, can you find the horses? You might have to look a little bit more deeply, and you might even take kind of a scanning approach to find them. They're right here in case you're wondering. You can try this at home. So here's our daughter when she was 2, and she had this bookshelf here. So I noticed when I would say, oh, can you find, this book? If she remembered the exact location, which she often did because children at this age can have exceptional memory, especially for spatial locations, she would be able to find it. But if I asked her for something non-preferred or had been moved to another area, it often took her a long time to find it. If I said to you, oh, can you find Paddington Bear, or her stuffed Paddington Bear, you would likely look immediately at the shelf right here because you've already perceived that these are books and these are stuffed animals, so you're more likely to find the stuffed animals. And so as the children develop, they can use this memory to start to make predictions, and then this prediction can help them target that visual search. You can look at your own child's visual search by using any book. Here's a popular scene from a popular book, Goodnight Moon, where you could say, find the kittens, right? And then just watch the child look. Do they start looking over at the top of the scene? Do they look out the window? Do they look on the floor? And you can make it more challenging by, asking for smaller details. One of the things too is because if I ask you to scan for small details, you might take a more ordered approach, or you've developed strategies for you either to predict or to systematically look for things. Because children are still developing these things, it takes them longer. And I'm often surprised, especially with a toddler, where I think they hadn't paid attention to the question. And then if I actually just wait a little bit longer, then they point to where it is. And I realized that they were trying, it's just taking them longer. And part of that is due to this control by the front part of the brain that is still developing. You can also see this with older children in counting objects. Initially, when my daughter was learning to count, she knew her numbers and understood the concept of counting, but she didn't have that ordered. And so she might take them out of sequence, which could lead to either double counting or missing one. But as she's become older and developed strategies to count more, she might take what you or I learned to do, which is a convenient convention of, in this case, reading left to right, and there's a higher probability of counting without missing or double counting. Another aspect of brain function that's very, for vision, that's very important is that the brain only sees what it's looking at. I think conceptually it's quite easy for us to understand that we can, improve our ability to find things visually if we order ourselves and use the kind of pilot in the front of the brain to guide. But I think very little of us are aware of how actually we are only perceiving what's in our center vision, and we actually have to look around. We have this perception that we see the whole scene in front of us, but it's actually many magic tricks rely on the fact that we believe we see everything that's happening when we're actually only processing to a great degree what's right in front of us. So in this famous picture, all the way back from the 15th or 16th century, you can see here, he's got his trick going here, and everybody's paying attention. And then this little child is, likely picking something that perhaps will then be used in a later trick. And because people don't think, oh, well, anybody's been near to me, it seems like magic, but this is actually taking advantage of this disconnect between what we perceive and what's actually happening. And the way the brain constructs the world when it can only pay attention to small parts is to move the eyes really rapidly. And these little jumping movements or saccades are so tiny and so fast that we're completely unaware of them. But if we're looking, for example, at this famous photo here, this is the lines drawn by a computer software that basically tracks the eye movement. And you can see that most of the time, the eyes are looking at the eyes and also at the facial expression. That's where we get a lot of information as humans. There's this cursory look around the edges, but you can see actually little to no attention is paid to this area at all by the eyes. And so here's a scene from Yellowstone with all of the bison resting on the open plains. And, we have the perception that we see everything really equally here, but actually the brain is using these tiny brief eye movements to take little snapshots and reconstruct the visual scene. Now, some of you may think, well, I'm into photography and this kind of stitching, where we take multiple photos and then stitch them together. That makes sense. That's what the brain's doing. But actually, that's not what the brain's doing, because the brain is actually doing something like this, where it's spending a lot of time looking at whatever, is decided to be the most interesting, and spending almost no time looking at the rest. Yet this is what we perceive. And so you and I, looking at the same picture, might actually see something quite different, because our brain is actually maybe choosing different aspects to focus on. So here, this is a little harder to try at home, and there could be multiple interpretations for this, but here you can see our son is quite interested in some object in the kitchen. And you can see that when my hand comes in, he says no, and he pulls it away. And so here he still got it. But when another, here, so you can see, yeah, so here you see he has the toy, he sees the hand coming in and he's like, nope, he's pulling away. But look what happens when another object catches his attention. Here he's still holding on to the other object, so we assume he wants it, but he doesn't seem to even notice that the other hand has come in. Now you could say alternate interpretation is he didn't want it anymore, that could be it, but he really doesn't seem to see the hand that's kind of reaching in for the egg at that point. So to sum up what the talk has covered so far is you can see that what babies see over early life really changes dramatically in the first few years, where at birth they don't see very well. They have to work on moving the eyes together. And once they can see in focus, detecting those edges, that allows them to detect simple patterns and then use those patterns and the transitions with the movement to interpret form, then to recognize objects. And then once we have objects, to start to understand categories such as animals and group objects by meaning. And then by being able to understand meaning, attach meaning to these objects, we can start to notice patterns that develop in the world or sequence of events so that we can predict things. And we can start to guide what we look at to help us navigate our environment. So just to sum up, that what babies learn to see is both interpreted and directed by the brain. It involves a lot of brain areas. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Cambridge Science Festival for hosting the talk, to the organizers and volunteers in our department at the Physiology, Development, and Neuroscience. Thank my children for teaching me and a lot about visual development, and also had the pleasure to know David Hubel when he was a professor emeritus and I was a medical student. And he's really a pioneer in this field and very inspiring.
Thank you for an amazing talk. I cannot wait for your kids to grow up and see this presentation. They're going to love it so much. So just as a quick reminder, if you do have questions, please feel free to use the chat and I can see it and ask the questions. I'll start it off though. One of the interesting things that you showed was the eye tracking, and in particular how we look at a face, for example, and what we focus on. Has that study been done with babies, and are the patterns similar or change as they grow up?
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. They have been done with babies, and one of the advantages of eye tracking is it doesn't require language and it doesn't require people to follow. Well, I mean, ideally the head is oriented towards the camera that's doing the tracking, so I guess there is some. But they have done it, and it's actually quite interesting. One of the studies that was done is they show like a little video, to a baby, and then they look tracking over time. And actually, how much time the children spend looking at the whole environment versus the eyes does change over the first few months. And I think that's also indicative of how we start to learn and make predictions, changes the interest and the percentage of time that we spend looking at different either parts of the face or other pictures.
I guess kind of along kind of a similar line of how babies initially start to understand their environments. One thing that caught my eye from the cricket example when counting is that the crickets were always a different perspective. So is there a point where babies start to understand that looking at different angles is actually the same object?
Yes, I think first of all, key is to be able to identify form. That's something, say my hand here is distinct from the other parts of my body, or the virtual, well, I guess it disappears into the virtual background there. So once you start to distinguish form, because the motion is a very powerful, then I think babies do start to recognize different parts. And there are actually cells in the brain that are kind of located in these areas between, say, the parts of the brain that develop, that process information from the eyes, and parts that process sound, and particularly language, that will actually respond to pictures of people from different angles and things. So there are these integrative areas of the brain that help us say, okay, that's mom in side view or mom straight on.
Yeah, and I think as well when your son was grabbing onto the contrasting object and obviously had no interest in it, that instinctual grab was very interesting. So it made me start thinking, how much of the training to see contrast is independent of conscious thought?
Yeah, so I had a professor when I was an undergraduate at MIT, who in the last lecture for the introductory, uh, ner- uh, neuroscience course is basically said, we have this perception that we're one person, but we're actually, many people that, have different desires. And I was like, whoa, this is getting very philosophical. But then I sort of understood what he meant, because we all have conflicting desires, right? Like right now, you may be part of you is enjoying watching the YouTube, and part of you is, needs to go to the toilet, or, things like that. And so we're constantly having to balance these needs. And I think we see this in little children, right? Because they don't have the same emotional regulation as adults, right? Where sometimes there can be very competing needs. And so, like grabbing things around him is a great desire at that age. But also he's like, really, he doesn't really like that particular snack. And so I think there's those kind of mix. Or the egg timer, the egg timer is super fascinating, but nothing tops the iPhone, apparently.
I think that's something we all agree on. I think there's a question in the chat from Sounds of Silence. It seems that the conceptual understanding started to come into play later in infancy. How do you study this kind of thing? I.e., how can you know if conceptual knowledge is in play?
Yeah, so the field of developmental psychology has many fascinating kind of experimental paradigms to be able to try to get at these concepts. I think that for me, it was quite fascinating to really look to see how these play out at home. When I had my N=2 longitudinal study, where I got many data points throughout the day. And I think here, I think this recognition of categories was one of the earliest things where I was really confident that they had some, kind of concept or contextual information. The other thing too is the development of language for children who speak early can also be quite. One of the most fascinating things to me is because we lived in Cambridge and my parents lived in America, is that I often wondered, like, is speaking on video chat or FaceTime with my family, like, what do my children have a recognition of that? But when my daughter was pre-verbal, my father would always make this like kind of clicking sound. And then she could when she started to be able to make that sound, which she could before she could speak, she saw him, she would make that sound. And so I think she clearly not just like recognized him, I think that was evidence of that, but it associated him with a different sensory modality. And this evidence of this kind of sensory like this sensory social integration coming within the first few months. There's some exciting experiments done where they show either videos or play sounds that are either something relatively non-social like water running versus somebody coughing or sneezing, and already they can see that babies respond differently to the sounds that are associated with humans, kind of social sounds than ones that are kind of neutral social content. So I think there's several different ways that we can find this. I was also very shocked with our daughter before she was verbal too. Once I said grandpa when I was talking to my husband, and she made the clicking sound. So clearly she had, associated, the seeing somebody making the clicking sound repeatedly on the FaceTime with his name, grandpa, and then understanding that we could refer to him in different conversations, So I think the other thing that's surprising with kids is that because we generally judge people's cognition incorrectly, right, by their ability to articulate verbally or by their, physical responses. And of course, speaking is a physical response, right? It's like one of the most fine and difficult motor tasks that we do is talking. Because you have to coordinate the lips, the tongue, the soft palate, the larynx, the lungs, in all very fine and rapid succession. And so, because we often judge perception, like what the person's understanding and perceiving of their internal perceptions of the outside world by what they can express outwardly, I think we often really underestimate what children are doing.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear that association from something that's not even a real person per se to to the verbal.
Oh yeah, and I think I'm sure now with the pandemic, many other people are experiencing this as well. But my children, like we only went a few times a year to America, and I definitely felt that they developed a relationship with their relatives, in America, or with my husband's relatives in Sweden, over that really built, and they recognized them in person and made an association between what they had seen on the call and the person that they saw in person. And so I thought that was also really remarkable because, even more complicated than side profile or front profile, but to understand that, somebody can be on a screen and in person is apparently more intuitive than to some of us who are older.
Yeah. We do have another question from Hugo Smith. Thanks for a great talk. To what extent are the functional divisions of visual cortex defined before birth, or do they form as the baby becomes more experienced at visual processing?
So I think this is a great question, because this is really where Hubel and Wiesel, who started recording from the cat brain, wanted to know what are these cells doing, and what are they responding to, and how does the sensory environment influence that development. And prior to their work in the 1950s, the brain as a whole was kind of seen as this blank slate they call tabula rasa, right? This is just like written on by the world. But actually what was found is that there are these different brain areas and cells that are primed, waiting for specific types of information. And then they use, for example, the early visual information to really tune their cells. So initially a cell might respond to many different visual aspects, but over time it shows a strong preference. And those strong preferences for different types of input allow for different types of complex functions to form. And what's really fascinating now is that because of the paradigms that were used in the second half of the 20th century to understand, how the brain processes visual information this way, now as people vary the types of stimulation they give, we can see even more and more different varieties of function that these types of cells can do. So now, making predictions about movement and all sorts of things, receiving connections from other areas of the brain that help shape this, our kind of understanding of how we process and understand the world around us keeps expanding. And I think that's one of the really exciting parts of neuroscience to me, is that there's just so much more to learn. And also to understand at different levels, right? This whole talk talked about how to, looking at the behavioral level, what are babies doing? How can we take a guess at how they perceive the world based on, their behavior, watching their behavior. But, we can also, people use what's called neuroimaging, right? Using a magnetic resonance imaging scanner or other technologies to try to look at brain area activation. And then using either animal or cellular models, we can also see, how does this happen on the individual level of the brain cells or groups of brain cells which act in small networks. So I think and then of course there's molecular and genetic levels as well. And so just kind of across scale as well as across the lifetime, I think there's just so much more exciting things to learn.
Absolutely.